From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Donald Trump has tweeted more than 43,000 times. He's insulted thousands of people, many different types of people. But when he tweets about infestation, it's about black and brown people.
President Trump's facing widespread condemnation after describing Baltimore as a disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. Trump's racist remark came in an attack on Congressman Elijah Cummings, one of the most prominent African-American lawmakers in Washington. We'll go to Baltimore for response, then to Russia, where a leading opposition figure has been hospitalized after possibly being poisoned in jail. This came as police in Moscow arrested nearly 1,400 opposition protesters in the largest crackdown in a decade.
I came because I want opposition candidates who are being blocked from taking part in the election to be allowed to do so. It is a big problem because there are very few worthy faces who would represent our interests. I am here for the freedom of speech and choice.
And we'll look at a historic protest in Colombia held to condemn the surge of lethal attacks on indigenous and environmental leaders in recent years.
Stop with the selective and systematic murder of activists, of men, of women, of indigenous people, of Afro-Colombians, farmers and students who are defending the right to live on their territories, for the right of biodiversity to be respected, for the peace agreements to be respected.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Baltimore residents and representatives are defending their city after President Trump described Baltimore as a disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess as he engaged in a Twitter attack against House Oversight Chair Elijah Cummings, one of the most prominent African-American lawmakers in Washington. Trump tweeted Cummings' district is, quote, considered the worst in the USA, and no human being would want to live there. Trump's attacks came after Fox News ran a story about Baltimore and after Cummings criticized the conditions of immigration jails along the Mexican border. An editorial in the Baltimore Sun Saturday was headlined, "Better to have a few rats than to be one." On Saturday, CNN anchor Victor Blackwell choked up on air when discussing Trump's comments about his hometown.
The president says about Congressman Cummings' district,
Blackwell chokes up.
That no human would want to live there. You know who did, Mr. President? I did. From the day I was brought home from the hospital to the day I left for college. And a lot of people I care about still do. There are challenges, no doubt. But people are proud of their community.
CNN's Victor Blackwell noted Trump frequently used the dehumanizing word infested when describing people of color. We'll have more on this story by going to Baltimore after headlines. In Northern California, a gunman killed 3 people and wounded at least 15 others at the annual Gilroy Garlic Festival Sunday. The gunman was also killed at the scene by police who say they're on the hunt for a second suspect. One of the victims of the attack was a 6-year-old boy. Meanwhile, in New York City, at least one person died and another 11 were injured after a shooting at a popular block party in Brownsville, Brooklyn, Saturday. The annual event draws people to the neighborhood from out of state for musical performances and other festivities. People say they're looking for 2 suspects. In a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court Friday allowed President Trump to move ahead with the use of $2.5 billion of military funds to build his wall on the U.S.-Mexico border after he declared a national emergency in February. Last month, a federal judge halted the move, saying Trump does not have the authority to circumvent Congress to appropriate the funds required for construction. In a statement, the ACLU responded by saying, quote, border communities, the environment, and our Constitution's separation of powers will be permanently harmed should Trump get away with pillaging military funds for a xenophobic border wall Congress denied, they said. Meanwhile, in a surprise move, the Trump administration and the Guatemalan government signed what the White House says is a safe third country agreement Friday, despite widespread condemnation of the plan plan by human rights experts and injunctions by a Guatemalan court that halted the agreement from going ahead without approval from Congress. The agreement would require asylum seekers who journey through Guatemala en route to the United States to apply for asylum in Guatemala instead of at the U.S.-Mexico border. It would primarily affect Honduran and Salvadoran migrants. The signing of the deal took place following threats from Trump last week to impose tariffs and other penalties, including a possible travel ban on Guatemala. Legal challenges are expected in both the U.S. and Guatemala. On Saturday, hundreds of Guatemalans gathered outside the presidential palace, protesting the agreement and demanding the resignation of President Jimmy Morales. President Trump announced Sunday Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence, has resigned. Coats and Trump have clashed over Mueller's investigation and Trump's frequent attacks on intelligence agencies. Earlier this month, Coats appointed Shelby Pearson as a new election security czar. Trump said he would nominate Texas Congressman staunch ally John Ratcliffe to replace Coats. Trump was reportedly pleased by Ratcliffe's questioning during last week's House Judiciary hearing with Robert Mueller, in which Ratcliffe told the former special counsel, quote, "Nowhere does it say you were to conclusively determine Donald Trump's innocence or that the special counsel report should determine whether or not to exonerate him," he said. Brazil's far-right President Jair Bolsonaro threatened journalist Glenn Greenwald with possible imprisonment Saturday following recent reporting by Greenwald's news website The Intercept implicating Justice Minister Sergio Moro in a possible plot to smear and convict former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Speaking to a reporter, Bolsonaro said Greenwald could not be deported because he was married to a Brazilian, but that he might be imprisoned instead. Journalists and press freedom activists blasted Bolsonaro's threats, and Greenwald responded via Twitter, "Contrary to what the president says, he is not yet a dictator. He doesn't have the power to order people to stop. To detain someone, you need to present evidence to a court showing that a crime was committed. That evidence does not exist," Greenwald said. To see our interview with the Pulitzer Prize-winning Glenn Greenwald on The Intercept's expose of Mordo and the Operation Car Wash scandal, go to DemocracyNow.org. In northern Brazil, residents of a remote indigenous village say at least 10 heavily armed gold miners in military uniforms raided their community last week, stabbing a leader to death. The assault on the Waiapi village came as new government data show that deforestation in the Amazon has dramatically increased since President Bolsonaro took office in January, losing more than 1,300 square miles of forest cover, a 39% increase over the same period last year. The drastic change is due to Bolsonaro's rolling back of regulations and punitive measures on illegal logging. In May, a group of former Brazilian environment ministers warned, quote, "We're facing the risk of runaway deforestation in the Amazon." One former minister said Brazil was becoming an exterminator of the future. In Moscow, police responded to an opposition protest Saturday by arresting nearly 1,400 people and beating back demonstrators with batons. The protest was organized to denounce the recent barring of opposition candidates from running in an upcoming election for Moscow City Council and followed a similar protest a week earlier, which brought out an estimated 20,000 people. Meanwhile, one of Russia's most prominent opposition figures, Alexei Navalny, has been hospitalized after reportedly suffering an acute allergic reaction in jail. He was arrested Wednesday and sentenced to 30 days in jail. Navalny's doctor said he may have been exposed to some toxic agent. We'll have more on the protests in Russia later in the broadcast. In Hong Kong, police deployed tear gas and rubber bullets against pro-democracy protesters at a mass demonstrations that shook the semi-autonomous territory for the 8th straight week. Police say they arrested 49 protesters Sunday. The popular uprising started to demand the withdrawal of an extradition bill that would have sent people from Hong Kong to mainland China to face charges. But demands quickly grew for the resignation of Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, an investigation into violence against demonstrators and pro-independence reforms. In Afghanistan, at least 20 people were killed and 50 others wounded Sunday after suicide bombers targeted the offices of a leading vice presidential candidate in the capital, Kabul. The blast preceded an hours-long gun battle that saw more than 150 civilians forced to evacuate the 4-story office building. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack, which targeted Amrullah Saleh, Afghanistan's former intelligence chief and running mate to President Ashraf Ghani, who's seeking another term in elections scheduled for September 28th. in Libya. The UN-backed Government of National Accord says an attack by a renegade general Saturday killed 5 medical workers and wounded 7 others at a field hospital outside Tripoli. It's the latest deadly assault on Libya's capital city by forces loyal to former Libyan General Khalifa Haftar, who already controls much of eastern Libya. In Bahrain, a 22-year-old activist died Sunday after taking part in protests against the execution of 2 men, despite calls from human rights groups and the United Nations to halt their killings. The young man's cause of death is unknown, though activists say there were clashes with police during Saturday's protests. Local authorities have said he died of natural causes. The 2 executed men were convicted in a mass trial on terror charges last year, but human rights advocates say confessions were obtained through torture. Speaking to Al Jazeera, a Bahraini activist linked the timing of the executions to the recent announcement by the U.S. government that it's reinstating the federal death penalty. Mariam Al-Khawaja said, quote, "Gulf states always feel they need a green light to commit the violence they commit. If the U.S. is going to start federal executions again, the Bahrain government feels it has the green light to do the same," she said. Meanwhile, in Britain, an activist who staged a protest against the executions Friday night on the roof of the Bahraini embassy in London reportedly had to be rescued by British police after he was seized by embassy staff. The Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy, which organized the action, say that embassy staffers tried to throw the demonstrator off the roof and that he could be heard screaming after being apprehended. British authorities say they were not able to verify that account. Back in the United States, the Justice Department approved the merger Friday of T-Mobile and Sprint in a move that critics say would increase cell phone bills for consumers by decreasing competition. The Justice Department say they only approved the deal after T-Mobile and Sprint agreed to sell some of their assets to satellite TV provider Dish Network to create a new wireless network. 13 attorneys general in the District of Columbia are suing to block the $26 billion merger. Senator and 2020 candidate Elizabeth Warren tweeted, "This merger will cost thousands of jobs, reduce wages, and further reduce competition in a sector that badly needs it. We need antitrust regulators with the courage to stand up to monopolies," Warren said. House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler said he'll petition a federal judge to get access to former special counsel Robert Mueller's secret grand jury evidence Friday, as his committee considers whether they'll undertake impeachment proceedings against President Trump. Nadler also said he would sue former White House counsel Don McGahn as early as this week to compel his testimony. 107 House Democrats have said they would back an impeachment inquiry. That's just 11 short of a majority on the Democratic caucus. And in Colombia, demonstrators took to the streets in more than 50 cities and towns Friday to protest a surge of lethal attacks on indigenous and environmental leaders. Since a historic peace accord was signed in 2016, over 400 human rights activists have been killed for their work combating illegal mining, drug trafficking, and land restitution causes. This is activist Gloria Cuartas.
Stop with the selective and systematic murder of activists, of men, of women, of indigenous people, of Afro-Colombians, farmers, and students who are defending the right to live on their territories, for the right of biodiversity to be respected, for the peace agreements to be respected.
We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. And finally, 22-year-old Egan Bernal has become the first Colombian to win the Tour de France. He's the youngest cyclist to win the race in 110 years. This victory is not for one rider, but for an entire country, Bernal said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's facing widespread outrage after describing Baltimore as a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent-infested mess. Trump made the remark in a tweet attacking Congressman Elijah Cummings, one of the most prominent African-American lawmakers in Washington. Trump tweeted, Baltimore is, quote, considered the worst in the USA and no human being would want to live there. Cummings, who chairs the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, has represented Maryland's 7th District, which includes parts of Baltimore, since 1996. Trump's initial tweets came after Fox News ran a story about Baltimore and after Cummings criticized the conditions of immigration jails along the Mexican border. Officials across Baltimore and Maryland denounced the president's remarks. The Baltimore Sun responded by publishing an editorial headlined, "Better to have a few rats than to be one." On Saturday, CNN anchor Victor Blackwell discussed Trump's comments about his hometown, Baltimore.
Infested. That's usually reserved for references to rodents and insects, but we've seen the president invoke infestation to criticize lawmakers before. You see a pattern here? Donald Trump has tweeted more than 43,000 times. He's insulted thousands of people, many different types of people. But when he tweets about infestation, it's about black and brown people. Infested, he says. The president says about Congressman Cummings' district.
Blackwell then choked up.
That no human would want to live there. You know who did, Mr. President? I did. From the day I was brought home from the hospital to the day I left for college. And a lot of people I care about still do. There are challenges, no doubt. But people are proud of their community. I don't want to sound self-righteous, but people get up and go to work there. They care for their families there. They love their children who pledge allegiance to the flag, just like people who live in districts of congressmen who support you, sir. They are Americans, too.
That was CNN anchor Victor Blackwell on air on Saturday. Trump responded to the widespread criticism by accusing Congressmember Elijah Cummings of being racist in a tweet Sunday. This all comes 2 weeks after Trump unleashed a racist attack on 4 progressive congresswomen of color, telling them to go back to the crime-infested places from which they came. The tweets were aimed at Congressmembers Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, all 4 U.S. citizens, 3 of the 4 born in the United States. We go now to Baltimore, where we're joined by 2 guests. Kay Wise Whitehead is an associate professor of communication and African American studies at Loyola University, Maryland, host of a local radio show in Baltimore. And Davon Love is director of public policy for Leaders of Beautiful Struggle. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Davon Love, let's begin with you. Your response to this attack on Baltimore. No human would want to live there, President Trump said.
Well, one of the things I think is important in putting Trump's tweets in perspective is that we live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy. And the things that Trump says in his tweets are actually, widely held beliefs in the American collective consciousness. Notions of black inferiority that span from things like black folks being inherently criminal, black folks being inherently intellectually inferior, black folks being inherently pathological. And so, and the way that shows up in our society is through popular narrations and representation of black people as pathological. And so what I think is important in terms of my own reaction to Trump's tweets, it's important to note that what he's expressing is a societal belief, that he's not exceptional in the sense that he believes it. Now, it's exceptional that he would express it in the way that he did in such open fashion. But I think the tweets itself, I think, are demonstrative of a societal belief that animates the institutions of civil society that really create a circumstance where particularly black folks in the kinds of communities that he's talking about experience the feeling of folks, both by way of policies and rhetoric, that don't deem them as human beings. And so he's capitulating to a base that believes those things more overtly than the kind of subconscious belief that I think permeates all of American civil society.
And Kay Wise Whitehead, your response as Trump talks about this infestation, as Victor Blackwell so movingly pointed out in his commentary on his show on CNN, you go back to see when he uses the word infested with people of color, like John Lewis. He attacked and talked about infestation. Of course, talking about the squad, the congresswomen of color, saying they should go back to their crime-infested countries. Of course, they're from the United States, 3 of the 4 of them. And then talking about Baltimore in the way he did, with the Baltimore Sun's headline being, we'd rather have a few rats than be one.
What is interesting is that Donald Trump is harkening back to a time when black people were categorized as being subhuman. using infestation, something you don't want, something that's despicable, something that's unneeded, something that you want to get rid of, and using that particular language whenever he talks about black and brown people is something that is not new. It goes back to a time of slavery. That is how black people have been categorized in this country. That is at the root and the heart of white supremacy and white nationalism. We can also take it back a little bit farther. We can talk about how in Germany the Jews were called an infestation. We could talk about in Rwanda there was a notion of infestation. This is what the term you use whenever you're talking about people that are the minority in the population that's not warranted, the population that's not considered to be in any way equal to or superior to the dominant majority. Donald Trump is not giving us new language. It is not surprising. What it is more frustrating than anything else, because what he has unleashed in this country, what he has allowed to have happen, what he has given the okay to, is this notion that you can say the deep-rooted racist things that you think about, the things you probably say at your kitchen table, you can now say them out loud. You can now call the cops on black people who are simply living their lives. You can now tell black people to go back and get out of the country. You can now tell brown people you don't belong here. What he is reminding us of is this sense that white men, some white men in particular, believe that America only belongs to people who look like them. That is what we're fighting against. That's what the real battle is against. The heart and soul of what this country is going to look like once his presidency is done. Because Donald Trump can be removed from office, but what he has unleashed will remain unless we fight it to the very end.
Interestingly, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner's company, owns somewhat 9,000 rental units, has been called a slumlord in Maryland, many mice-infested. The company's been cited for, 200 code violations. Can you talk a little about that?
Well, this notion that with Jared Kushner and the ownership, and we were talking about the 9,000 units, I think it was really 170 code violations, it then harkens back to a time that the people that are pointing the fingers, the people that are pointing out what is wrong, are the people who are actually perpetuating the stereotypes. Jared Kushner has done no work to clean up the area. Donald Trump has been called on to put a policy in plan, an urban renewal policy, to come to Baltimore, to not just use Baltimore as something to point your finger at, Baltimore something to laugh at, Baltimore something to attack, but coming up with a plan to help American cities, in which Baltimore is one of many that could use a policy and a plan for urban renewal and for going forward. What Donald Trump is doing and what Jared Kushner has done has only added to the problem. It's made Baltimore the center and taken our focus off what the real issue is, which is what Congressman Elijah Cummings will be doing this week. Once again, what Donald Trump is doing is taking a chance to direct us away from what we should be focused on, which is impeachment, which is getting him out of office, which is figuring out exactly what he's doing, which is thinking about what's happening with Russia. No, instead, we're now defending ourselves. We're doing campaigns, hashtag We Are Baltimore, to remind the world that we are part of America and that we are important and that we matter. Again, it's just a policy that he has. It's a way to have us defend, a way to have us step back, a way to have us be hurt, to have us cry, rather than have us attack.
I wanted to go to White House Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney speaking on Sunday on CBS's Face the Nation. Host Margaret Brennan questioned Mulvaney about Trump's comments.
No human being would want to live there.
When Donald Trump attacks
this
people,
is being perceived as racist. Do you understand why?
I understand why, but that doesn't mean that it's racist. The president is pushing back against what he sees as wrong. It's how he's done in the past, and he'll continue to do in the future.
Dave Unlove, if you could respond, and also, the same time he is tweeting up the storm right through today, the president wants to move ahead with pouring billions and billions and billions of dollars into a wall on the southern border. He is, rather than the infrastructure of this country.
Well, so a couple things. One is that particularly the phrase "no human being will want to live there." What that speaks to is the fact that in this society, when we, again, talking about the system of racism and white supremacy, we're talking about the fact that notions of humanity have often been reserved for white folks, that white folks have been able to construct a universe by which their collective interests are understood as universal and central. And so the idea that no human being will want to live there is a part of this kind of Negro-phobic aspect of our society, where all the kind of negative stereotypes are projected onto black people. But in many ways, white folks in their communities experience, or engage in many of the behaviors that we criminalize. So when you think about things like this, the notion of a drug dealer, right, and that the kind of societal image, right, is of black men. But when you think about, all the white men that are selling drugs on college campuses around the United States, right, they're not demonized in that same way because, again, their collective interests are understood as normative, they're understood as kind of the central aspect of the American ethos. Furthermore, particularly in terms of, all the investments that the president has made as it relates to, so-called border security, I think it's important to understand that that is the remnants or the manifestation, the extension of the system of white supremacy, the idea of being secure, right, from the criminalized immigrants that come into the United States. That language is language that is borrowed right from, when you look at Birth of a Nation, first major motion picture film in the United States that was screened in the White House that represented a black man, a white person in blackface, a black man as a brute. And one of the central storylines was him as a rapist. Right. So we're talking about the language the president and the conservatives use about immigrants borrows directly from the playbook of white supremacy that characterizes black people as inherently criminal, as inherently dangerous, as inherently pathological. And so, and I want to highlight something that Dr. Whitehead said that I think is really important, is that this is not new, right? This is not something that is emerging out of nowhere. That this rhetoric and this discourse is part and parcel of a society that is run in such a way that allows for folks like Jared Kushner to be able to have properties and treat black folks with a level of contempt, because that is just the very nature of the society that we live in. And so we have to attack the system of white supremacy and the prevailing notions of black inferiority that animate the institutions in such a way that then not only impact black people, but as we're seeing with the migrant crisis, with the immigration crisis on the border, impacts those policies as well.
Right.
Professor Whitehead, I assume this makes it a little difficult to call out longtime elected officials who you believe are fair to criticize, to work on your city, not to mention other cities around the country.
Now, what's interesting, Amy, is that on my radio show Today with Dr. K on WEAA, we talk about this every day. We talk about our politicians. We talk about what's wrong with the city. We work to push to hold our politicians accountable. When we're dealing with the water crisis over in Poe Homes, when we're dealing with what's happening with the heating situation in the schools, when we're talking about the state of violence and crime in our neighborhoods, we want to hold our politicians' feet to the fire. But unfortunately, at this moment, we can't do that. At this moment, we actually cannot call out our politicians, because what the president has done, he's put us all in this defense mode where we have to talk about how we are all Baltimore. My hope is that as we move past this moment, as he turns his lens to somewhere else, because we know Donald Trump's playbook is that you focus on something, you use racist tropes to attack it, the world begins to defend, and while we're defending, he's laughing, he's gleeful, and then he turns to his next target. Like, we know that's how he operates. My hope is that we use this moment to talk about what we can do. And I mean, we all collectively, all of us here in Baltimore, all the people that say they love Baltimore, all the politicians who are working for Baltimore, we use this as a moment to come up with a strategy on how we can move this city forward. I know that Davon Love and Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, for example, Erica Bridgeford and the Baltimore Ceasefire, we have organizations right here in this city doing the hard work. I want us to continue to do the hard work, because Baltimore will survive. We're resilient. We can deal with the lens from the president, and we can still move forward and be better.
I want to thank you both for being with us, Professor K. Wise Whitehead of Loyola University, Maryland, and Davon Love of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, speaking to us from Baltimore, Maryland. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, close to 1,400 Russians are arrested in Moscow, and a leading dissident in jail. Was he poisoned? Stay with us. Lafayette Gilchrist here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Russia, where police in Moscow used violent force to stop an opposition protest Saturday. Nearly 1,400 people were rounded up in what's been described as the largest mass arrest in Russia in a decade. Meanwhile, one of Russia's most prominent opposition figures, Alexei Navalny, has been hospitalized after suffering an acute allergic reaction in jail. Navalny's doctor said he may have been exposed to some toxic agent. Navalny was arrested Wednesday ahead of Saturday's protest and sentenced to 30 days in jail. Saturday's protest was organized to denounce the recent barring of opposition candidates from running in an upcoming election for Moscow's city council. Protesters spoke out against the election authorities.
We're here so that the independent candidates for whom we have left our signatures would be allowed to participate in the election. They should take part, and the citizens should vote. If they were allowed, let people decide for themselves who will represent them. That is it.
We're joined now by Samuel Green, director of the Russia Institute at King's College London. His book, co-authored with Graham Robertson, is just out. It's titled Putin versus the People, The Perilous Politics of a Divided Russia. He's also author of Moscow and Movement, Power and Opposition in Putin's Russia. Samuel Green, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Talk about the significance of this mass arrest of over 1,300 people.
We really haven't seen anything quite on this scale before. I think over the last year or so, we have seen a tendency towards sort of increasing confrontation. Obviously, the opposition increasingly frustrated. They're not able to get on the ballot. They're not able to get the constitutional rights that are guaranteed to them in terms of participating in elections. And in fact, the right to assemble peacefully in protests, which is also guaranteed by the Constitution. The government has banned more and more protests, but we've also seen at those protests that they have been more frequently bringing out the riot police. And if, a few months ago we used to see, a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred people being carted away in police vans, now we're seeing much greater numbers, and we're seeing a lot more violence, right? So we saw, broken bones, we saw blood, we saw things being thrown. We saw, if you see the video, some of what you were just showing earlier this morning, right? There's clearly a fairly vicious response. And I think it's worth noting that this response is not provoked, right? So the protesters are, to an extent, breaking the law in that the protests were not sanctioned by the government, but they were doing nothing more than occupying a public space, right? We didn't see rioting, we didn't see destruction of property, we didn't see rock throwing and that sort of thing.
And talk about what's happened with Alexei Navalny, who was imprisoned on Wednesday. They said he was calling for the protests on Saturday, and now it's not clear what has happened to him.
It is not at all clear, right? So he is periodically dragged off to prison for a period of time. This time it was for 30 days on the charge of calling for people to participate in an unsanctioned protest. He's fairly familiar with this drill, as a lot of opposition figures in Russia are these days. He was, during or just after the protests, sort of moved off to a hospital with what was called a severe allergic reaction. The report was that there was a lot of swelling around his face and neck. His doctors came out to the hospital, his personal doctors came out to the hospital to check on him. They were not allowed access. I think they were able to see him and to a certain extent interview him through a closed door, but not more than that. Their report is that it does not seem to be an allergic reaction. Their feeling is that there may be some kind of toxic chemical that has somehow entered his system. And of course, people
his doctor,
in and around the opposition.
He is calling for his sheets and everything around him to be tested. He was released apparently from the hospital, back in jail. And for people who don't know who Alexei Navalny is, if you could explain, and what's his relationship with Putin?
Well, it's not a pleasant relationship. Navalny has been probably the most prominent opposition leader in Russia since the last major wave of protests against Putin emerged in 2011, 2012. He is a lawyer and a anti-corruption campaigner who's built a network of activists around the country, both to run anti-corruption investigations into public officials, including the president himself, but many others in the system, and to contest elections for office really throughout the political system. So going up from things like city councils, as we have coming up the Moscow City Council election in September, right up to the presidency. Navalny himself was barred from running in the presidential election in 2018, which, of course, Putin won handily.
In a recent tweet, Samuel Green, you wrote, Putin knows he's more likely to be brought down by elite defection than by mass unrest. Can you explain?
Sure. Right. So, Putin's role in the Russian political system, at least as I understand it, right, is to make the system work for the people at the top of the system, right? So there are a lot of very powerful interests in the economy, in the bureaucracy, in the security services, who, themselves are not exactly legitimate with the average Russian citizen, who see them as sort of living off the wealth of the country at a time when many Russians are not doing very well, right? When there's growing inequality and so on. Putin's role is to manage that system, but really, very importantly, to make sure that to manage the relationship with the Russian people, right? He can be popular at a time when the rest of the Russian elite are not, and he's been able to do that reasonably well. But what we've been seeing in recent months as the economy really has stagnated, really for the last 6 years or so, we've seen declining real incomes for ordinary Russians and no light at the end of the economic tunnel. So we've seen Putin's poll figures begin to decline. We're seeing now a majority of respondents to opinion polls in Russia say they think the country is headed in the wrong direction. And that causes some nervousness among elites in terms of whether or not Putin is going to be able to continue to run the system in their interests, right? And so he may have wanted to send a signal, right, to those elites that he is going to have, if you will, the courage of the system's convictions, right? That he will put the force of the state at the service of their interests and not be reticent to use violence, if need be, in managing the relationship with the opposition and perhaps with the public more broadly.
Can you also talk about the murder of a very prominent LGBTQ activist, Yelena Grigorieva? And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. Last August, dozens of LGBT activists were arrested during a banned protest in St. Petersburg, speaking up for sexual minorities. What happened to her?
Well, we don't really know. It is a little reminiscent of some of the conversations you were just having with your guests around the Baltimore and the climate of race in the United States, right? So Putin has run some of his campaigning and rebuilt a large part of his legitimacy around the use of wedge issues in ways that are familiar, I think, to American listeners and voters. One of the most powerful of which has been pushing against the LGBT community in Russia. So there's been a lot of punitive legislation, but there's also been just a lot of rhetoric, right, which has empowered people who are homophobic and who are inclined to use violence to feel that they can act with impunity. And so we have really, since this came to the fore in about 2012, we have seen increasing levels of violence among LGBT activists and, frankly, just members of the LGBT community in general. And because of the stigma associated with it, it's something that the police are simply not going to investigate with any seriousness. And so we're not likely, unfortunately, ever to know exactly what happened in this case.
You mentioned the comparison with Baltimore. What effect does President Trump's deference to Putin have on Putin and on Russians in general? I mean, you have these mass arrests that happened, the largest in a decade, of almost 1,400 people arrested. Trump doesn't tweet against that. He tweets against Baltimore, saying no human would want to live there.
Well, I'm not sure that the Kremlin is looking for approval or disapproval from Washington. It was certainly capable of doing these sorts of things when Obama was in office, and the U.S. State Department and the White House were much more robust in their criticisms of Russia. But what I think does matter is it makes it very difficult for if you will, the Western community in general, so the United States, its allies in Europe, in Canada and other places, to come up with some kind of a concerted policy response to Russia, right? That would really support, at least provide moral support to those who would like to see a different future for the country. If anything, I think it's demoralizing to the Russian opposition and to those who are fighting for their constitutional rights in the country.
And Professor Green, why local elections? Why? I mean, these are arrests around people calling for representation in the Moscow City Council. Why is this so significant in Russia today?
Well, there's a couple of reasons, right? So first of all, Moscow does have the largest concentration of sort of opposition supporters and potential opposition voters in the country. So if there's any part of Russia where they are likely to get some headway in elections, it is probably going to be Moscow. They have had representation on Moscow City Council before. Alexei Navalny himself ran for mayor back in 2014 and did a reasonable job of it. Lost, of course, but put up a better show than many expected him to. And we have seen a lot of the opposition's efforts really concentrated in Moscow as a result of that. They see that both, I think, as a way to get some momentum and to get some symbolic victories, but also really as a way to demonstrate to voters maybe more broadly, right, that they can have an impact, right? I think that the problem for the opposition in Russia is not so much that most Russians think that the country is well governed. They understand the level of corruption. They understand the level of dysfunction. But most Russians wouldn't believe that if you were to elect somebody else, that very much would change in their lives or in the way that the country is run. So the task for the opposition is, even if only on a local level, on a small scale, to begin to demonstrate to people that elections actually matter and can bring some change for the good, right? Given that the Kremlin has not been able, through economic policy or social policy or other means, really to engineer an improvement in Russians' livelihoods over the last 5 or 6 years or so, I think they are concerned about the ability of the opposition to provide that kind of an example, right? In the absence of a positive economic agenda from the Kremlin, I think at this point they're really running on the lack of a viable alternative, and so they're trying to prevent anything that would look like an alternative from emerging, even if it's only symbolic and at the local level.
Samuel Green, I want to thank you for being with us, director of the Russia Institute at King's College London. His book is just out, titled Putin versus the People, The Perilous Politics of a Divided Russia. When we come back, we look at the historic protests in Colombia and around the world, condemning the surge of lethal attacks on indigenous environmental leaders, more than 400 murdered in recent years. Stay with us.
Recoge solo tus ideas, levanta, apaga tu mirada para todo lo que venga. Me está llamando. El día que amanece lento, recoge solo tus ideas, levanta, apaga tu mirada para todo lo que venga. Me está llamando. Semilla que va germinando, paciencia que el enfoque llega, el tiempo que flota en el aire, las horas al viento se entregan. Semilla que va germinando, paciencia que el enfoque llega, el tiempo que flota en el aire y el viento se entrega. Me está llamando. De a poco te zafas del miedo, un dedo tras otro lo sueltan, en tu pecho una llamarada que por dentro quema. Me está llamando. De a poco te zafas del miedo, un dedo tras otro lo suelta, en tu pecho una llamarada que todo lo quema. Te está llamando y me está llamando. Óyelo. Y un fuego que todo lo quema, un fuego que todo lo quema. Responde que te está llamando, responde que te está llamando. Un fuego que por donde quema, un fuego que todo lo quema, y un fuego que todo lo quema, y un fuego
Flame and Calling by the Colombian-American band Maku Sound System, performing in our Democracy Now! Studios. You can go to democracynow.org to see the full interview and music. I'm Amy Goodman. On Friday, tens of thousands of demonstrators took to the streets in more than 50 cities and towns across Colombia, as well as in the United States, to protest a surge of lethal attacks on indigenous Afro-Colombian environmental leaders in recent years. Solidarity marches around the world from Mexico City to Athens. In 2016, the Colombian government and FARC rebels signed a historic peace accord to move Colombia forward after a half-century of armed conflict. But since then, nearly 500 human rights activists, many of them Afro-Colombian community, have been killed, targeted for their work combating illegal mining, drug trafficking, and land restitution and environmental causes. During Friday's mass mobilizations, protesters carried signs reading, "Without leaders, there can be no peace and no more bloodshed." This is activist Gloria Cuartas.
Stop with the selective and systematic murder of activists, of men, of women, of indigenous people, of Afro-Colombians, farmers and students who are defending the right to live on their territories, for the right of biodiversity to be respected, for the peace agreements to be respected.
Friday's protests came after a heartbreaking video went viral showing a young boy screaming inconsolably moments after witnessing a gunman shoot down his mother. The child's mother was the renowned community activist Maria del Pilar Hurtado, who advocated for the rights of landless peasants. She was killed in the northern province of Córdoba last month. In the video, the child can be seen screaming in grief near his mother's corpse. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Luis Gilberto Murillo. He served as governor of the predominantly Afro-Colombian Department of Choco, and in 2012, Murillo was the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia. From 2016 to 2018, under the previous president. He's currently a research fellow at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University, and was one of those who was protesting outside the Colombian ambassador to the United States' home in Washington, D.C. Luis Gilberto Murillo, thank you so much for joining us. Can you explain why you were out in the streets Friday and so many were out in your country of Colombia protesting the deaths of more than 400 activists in Colombia over the last few years?
Good morning, Amy, and thank you for this opportunity. Obviously, all Colombians went to the streets, a majority of them, last July 26, including here in Washington, where under the leadership of the Colombian Human Rights Committee here in Washington, we went to express our really sorry because of this tragedy of the killings of social leaders in Colombia. This is something that needs to move not only Colombia, but the entire international community. Most of the leaders that have been killed are social leaders, environmental leaders, community leaders, rural leaders that are really fighting for their rights. And what happened to Maria del Pilar Hurtado really moved the country. And we all went to the streets to really say that we are supporting these leaders, we are in solidarity with social leaders and against the assassinations, and also calling for the consciousness of Colombian society and the international community. And we really express our intention to break with the indolence and violence that have been really affecting all these communities in the areas that have been neglected for long time, and communities that really want to be included. Are communities that are fighting for peace, because those are communities that need basic services from the state, education, health, justice, to have the opportunity to access to the decent job. And this is why many communities like rural Afro-Colombians, indigenous, are really demanding the government to implement the peace agreement, because this is the opportunity for these communities to be integrated in a dignified way to the Colombian society.
Who is killing the activists, the social leaders, the environmentalists? The right-wing president of Colombia, President Iván Duque, claims the numbers of murders have dropped. We're talking about more than 400 in the last few years since the peace accord was signed.
Well, what we are people that are being killed are being killed because they are demanding their basic rights, and particularly the rights to access to land and to be free in their territories. Because if you only one number, Amy, about what is happening in Colombia, particularly in terms of inequality. In Colombia, 1% of big land owners have like 50% of the land. Only 70% of the entire rural land in Colombia belongs to 0.4% of productive units, while units that are very small only have 2% of the rural land. So the inequality is very high. This is only one example of it. So these leaders are demanding access to land, for example, and they are being killed for those who want to maintain in Colombia the status quo in rural areas, to maintain huge land ownership, and to avoid these Colombians to have access to land and basic services, as I said. And something that is happening is that the political climate that is being created in Colombia because of the critics of the peace agreement is that those who are connected to illegal groups feel very empowered to attack social leaders and to avoid the implementation of the peace process. This is why we are demanding full implementation of the peace process. And in addition to that, also to end the killings of social leaders. It's not to decrease the numbers of killings, because each life, every life is precious. And also the way to avoid these killings to happen is the full implementation of the peace process, because the peace process has some provision to protect social leaders. For example, there is a national commission to guarantee the protection of social leaders in the country, and that commission has been not convened regularly by the current government.
Can you talk about the role of the United States in its support for the Colombian government? And this goes back a ways, not just under Trump. The role of the U.S. and also U.S. corporations. You've been particularly concerned about Duque defending the use of Monsanto herbicide, Roundup Ready, to destroy coca crops.
Well, it's very important to say that the U.S. government have been supporting the implementation of the peace agreement. This started with the Obama administration. However, there is a lot of pressure now under Trump administration to go back to emphasis on coca eradication without paying attention to the provision of the peace agreement. For example, there's an intention of the current government to go back to use aerial spraying, aerial fumigation with glyphosate, with Roundup, to eradicate coca in many areas. This aerial fumigation is already banned by Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court reaffirmed that ban recently in a ruling that they had 2 weeks ago. And what we are saying is that aerial fumigation is an approach that have to be banned from Colombia because of the impact on health, on environment, and we are talking about aerial spraying with Roundup in area of the Amazon basin. We are talking about this aerial spraying affecting communities in those areas, Afro-Colombians, indigenous communities, rural communities in general, and it's not effective. It's not effective because in 2006 and 2007, when the fumigation was widespread, Colombia fumigated areas of the site of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island in the United States. And coca, instead of decreasing, coca cultivation increased. And also to eradicate one area of coca, you need to fumigate around 25 hectares of coca. So it's not really effective, it's very costly. So we think that in that regard, the inclination of the United States to support aerial spraying, aerial fumigation with Roundup is wrong.
And, of course, Roundup and Monsanto are facing massive lawsuits in the United States around people getting sick using Roundup-ready herbicides. Can you talk from Colombia to Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil right now as he threatens to, and what effect this has on the people of Colombia as well, slashing protections for the Amazon, his efforts to curtail his efforts to fight against illegal logging, etc.
Amy, let me say that first,
or I should say, he curtailed efforts to fight illegal logging.
Well, it's like the Amazon is very important not only for Brazil and for the countries like Colombia that are part of the Amazonian basin, but also it's important for the entire world. It's key to fight climate change. And also, in addition to that, we are talking about areas that have tremendous biodiversity. It's the most biodiverse area in the world. In terms of Colombia, obviously deforestation is a huge challenge. And not only for Colombia, for Peru and for Brazil. Colombia was able, because of the measures that were taken by the government, to decrease deforestation in 10% last year. However, in Brazil, the policy is very different. Bolsonaro is a denier of climate change, a member of his cabinet, and they are promoting a policy to increase the exploitation, increase the timber and logging in the Amazon basin, and that's creating obviously a climate for increasing dramatically deforestation in the Amazon, and this is very responsible for the entire region. And also, in addition to that, what we see is that is obviously weakening the implementation of measures to protect the rights of ethnic minorities, of indigenous communities, of Afro-descendant communities in their quilombolas that are key to protect that vital ecosystem for the entire world. And I think that in terms of the United States, we are inviting the United States and other countries to define a framework to really protect the Amazonian basin because of their importance. I think that the United States needs to give more priority to the protection of forests in the entire world, and particularly in the Amazon basin.
And finally, in this last minute we have, I have to admit it was a little hard to get in touch with you yesterday afternoon, Luis. I don't know if it was because of what was happening in Paris, but 22-year-old Egan Bernal has become the first Colombian to win the Tour de France. He's the youngest rider to win the race in 110 years. This is what he said.
Es increíble. Es increíble. No sé qué decir.
It's incredible. It's incredible. I don't know what to say. Really, yes, I won the Tour, but I still don't believe it. It is just unbelievable. I think I need a couple of days for it to settle in.
According to the BBC, Bernal's victory has resonated especially with Colombians from modest backgrounds, many of whom are from the same deprived, largely indigenous areas of Colombia's Andes Mountains. The significance of his win, Luis.
Well, we are very happy. We're celebrating the entire day because, it's incredible, as he said, and Egan is a role model for the entire community in Colombia, but particularly for our communities, those for indigenous Afro-descendants, for rural communities, what we call the other Colombia, that it really have the hope to be integrated, and also many children and youth see now again as their role model to show that the only limit that they have is the sky, and they will face obstacles, but it is possible. He made this possible, and the entire Colombia is celebrating. And this is a moment of pride for Colombia and for the entire Latin American region. So we are really very happy and still celebrating.
Well, Luis Alberto Murillo, we thank you so much for being with us. Twice governor, also former Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia, former governor of the predominantly Afro-Colombian department of Choco. And that does it for our show. He was outside the Colombian ambassador to the United States House on Friday, along with so many others and thousands throughout Colombia protesting the murders of activists in Colombia. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.